Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and now that we're starting to close off 2025 for good, we also have to dap into certain other areas that we know fine well Chris simply does not understand. But let's see if we can help him out on the way, shall we? Because parody, much like Chris's understanding of comedy, seems to be a little bit more based off of not so much an understanding about why it works, but rather just Chris stealing whatever he wants from television without any rhyme or reason, and just imagining people are gonna laugh at it because they laughed at it in a slightly different way. Yeah, but when it comes to parody, on the other hand, it's something that Chris absolutely does not understand, and something Chris tries to play off that he knows the difference, but let's see how well he understands by the end of this, or what we think about how he understands things. Parody. Any names or persons illustrated in any of the Solitude comics except that of Christian Weston Chandler that may seem similar to anyone in real life are purely coincidental or otherwise parodic. Chris's disclaimer page appearing in every episode and read before every video book. Also, Jason Kendrick Howell and his 17-year-old girlfriend Kathleen Nicole Wallace in this comic are based on the real people, and they have actually done things together that would be classified as illegal in the US of A. Send the police on them in Clarksville, Tennessee. So much of having a. There's not much point in having a disclaimer if you're immediately going to say, actually, you know what, go wild on them. Parody is an imitative work created to mock, comment on, or trivialize an original work, its subject, author, style, or some other target by means of humorous, satiric, or ironic imitation. The concept dates back to ancient Greece, as Hegemon of Phasos was credited with being the first man to change the words of poems to make them funny. In a broader sense, parodies need not to be humorous as long as they provide some sort of commentary on the original work. In that sense, a parody can be considered a sort of critical analysis of the original work. For Chris, the word parody is basically a way to secure copyrights for other people's ideas. A loophole, you may be saying. You might say. You see, parody falls under fair use in copyright law. So if Sonichu is a parody of Sonic the Hedgehog and Pokemon, then it's perfectly legal for Chris to turn Sonichu into a multimedia empire. Job done, sorted. However, why Sonichu is not a parody? How do we put this lightly? Well, unless you believe that boldly ripping off other media constitutes as parody, Sonichu is not a parody. The issue of whether or not Sonichu meets the criteria for fair use is academic. As it stands, Chris is simply one of the thousands of lame Sonic fans trying to make a name for himself by creating shitty recolors. For all of Chris's big dreams of developing Sonichu games, cartoons, and merchandise, he can barely muster the motivation to produce 2 issues of the comic each year, despite the quality of his workmanship. But still, the question remains, is Sonichu a parody? If humor is to be chief criterion, then the answer is obviously no. Nearly all of the humor to be found in the series is purely unintentional by the author. A good example of this principle in action is the infamous Family Guy sketch of Sonichu issue 7. This thing here, right here. The problem is that Chris isn't that clever, among other things that we know Chris isn't. As demonstrated by the way he shamelessly offers the gag to use in the show itself, indicating that Chris believes his imitation is tantamount to the genuine article. In terms of commentary on the original work, Sonichu is virtually devoid of this. Early issues would poke fun at Sonic and Pokemon characters, but this wasn't particularly insightful. Indeed, characters like Team Rocket and Dr. Robotnik are often mocked in the original works, so Chris was most likely just repeating what he'd seen. In Sonichu issue 1, Amy Rose meets Rosechew, but the scene is little more than a dry comparison of the two, who wind up being more alike than different. Even Jason Friedberg and Aaron Seltzer understand parody better than Chris. Freiberg and I don't know who those two are, sadly. Meanwhile, speaking legally rather than artistically, in the United States, a valid parody should demonstrate reasonably usage with regards to the amount of sustainability of the portion used in relation to the copyrighted work as a whole. To fall under fair use, in other words, the hypothetical defendants should be able to show that they have not taken any more of the original work than was necessary to achieve the purpose for which the material was copied from the original work. If Chris really does have some parodic purpose in mind for Sonichu, the sheer volume of ideas he has simply appropriated from other sources is weighted against him. Aside from using characters with names and appearances mostly or completely lifted from other works, the main storylines themselves are far too derivative of the original materials to qualify as pastiche or homage. Chris merely chooses to mix and match entirely ready made plots such as the quest for the Solitary Balls, circa Sonic the Hedgehog slash Dragon Ball, or the plight of Zelenia in Zelda 2 The Adventure of Link, making our superficial changes and avoiding any decent narration along the way. Ultimately, the main difficulty is proving the point against Chris would be delineating the numerous works he has used and where. Unfortunately for him, this has been done mostly by the efforts of, well, this article and including things we could take a look at next time. Perhaps by sheer coincidence, Sonichu has evolved into a shell of what a true Sonic slash Pokemon parody should be. Like the Sonic characters, the cast is composed of cutesy looking animals who have gradually slowed off the veneer of innocent video game mascots to engage in angsty dialogue and crude romantic entanglements. And, like Pokemon, the Sonichus and Rosechus are superpowered animals who battle in the service of a bossy, whiny human. In short, by combining the two franchises, Chris has wound up depicting a darker, more infantile reflection of each. The problem is that he fails to realize this. Also, to be fair, I'm pretty sure there are artists out there who can do this better anyway. Possibly, I have no idea. I know that there are some degenerates when it comes to the Sonic the Hedgehog community that somehow go who are slightly more degenerate for very different reasons, unlike Chris. But you know what I'm talking about, don't you? And so the actual commentary on Sonic and Pokemon is never properly realized. Well, that's to be expected because it seems to have been a complete. The only reason why we're even having this conversation is because it almost by complete accident as a result of Chris. During an IRC chat with Clyde Cash and Billy Mays, Chris spends an inordinate amount of time trying to explain how Sonichu is a parody of Sonic, though he entirely forgets Pikachu. But all he does is list their similarities. Even after the definition of parody is spelled out to him, he completely fails to find any element of Sonichu that is a legitimate parody of Sonic. He continues to insist that Sonichu is a parody because he's fast, but also has electricity powers. In his PowerPoint presentation, Chris even describes Sonichu's story as an untold chapter of one story, so it is additionally yet not a major plot change. Whatever the hell that means, which plants it quite firmly in the territory of derivative work, so non-canon and probably not even official. The irony is that by refusing to embrace Sonichu as a derivative, one-dimensional Sonic recolor, Chris fails to live up to his assertion that Sonichu is a parody. But Chris can't have it both ways. It's either original or a parody. The closest Sonichu ever comes to true parody is in its satirical depiction of Encyclopedia Dramatica in issue number 8. Instead of simply portraying ED as a website, Chris represents it as some sort of business housed in a physical building, with its users working there as some sort of staff, churning out slanderous content as an end unto itself. For once, Chris actually has a point to make that ED is a bunch of mean spirited jerks who waste their lives hurting people. This message is ham fisted as hell, but at least it's not the usual subtext like, I think hedgehogs are way past cool and I'd sure like to have sex. Then again, Given his belief that LOLs is an acronym for laughs under lucidities, it's quite possible that he believes, quite literally, that ED is a business. Chris also believes that stealing real people's names and basically portraying them as he sees them is parodic. This is, of course, untrue. And it's a complete miracle none of these people who were portrayed have ever sued Chris for slander. Which, yes, they absolutely could have done. They absolutely had a case for this. Like, for example, if somebody did a comic and they posted and they used my full legal name, I absolutely would be suing them for slander, and I would have told them in no plain terms I would be pressing charges. Yeah, exactly. And I don't care how I'm portrayed. You know what? That the point is that if it's meant to be my likeness and if it's hitting a little bit too close to home, I think that's more than enough. Yeah, life has been different since I've stood up for myself. I don't know why that is. Further demonstrating Chris's ignorance of the true nature of parody is his belligerence towards artists who have imitated his work. In particular, Chris was vehemently denounced of one Jimmy Hill for claiming credit for Sonichu and merchandising the character in Europe as an openly homosexual cartoon character. What Chris can't and won't understand is that Hill's use of Sonichu is exactly what a parody is supposed to be, since his version deliberately alters Sonichu to a humorous effect. In a court battle, the law is more likely to favour the work of trolls as parody, though there's some question of what happens when you parody something that's already stolen. Yeah, that's pretty interesting. But even if Chris understood fully what parody means, it likely wouldn't matter. Parody is simply a word Chris uses as one of many excuses he comes up with just to do whatever he wants. When he tried to strike a deal with Vivian G to cut a deal of her audiobook money, he said he was doing so despite not being happy with her work was parodic. While the audiobook straight up mocked Chris and his comic rather than act as a parody, to him it's not okay for him to be the subject of parody. But it's okay for him to make parodies of works that others have created off their own backs. Yeah, so hypocrisy at work. It's funny because you don't have to take accountability for it. Huh. So it seems that he understands on a basic level that a parody is intended to make fun of something, but he changes the meaning of the word to suit his needs when he's called out on how Sonichu is plagiarism. Indeed, plagiarists usually don't condone plagiarism when they're the ones being plagiarized. Sonichu as a meta parody. On the other hand, Chris's narcissism makes him a virtuoso at self parody, so if he ever sues himself, he's covered. I don't know. Is it possible for both parties to lose in the same court? You tell me, guys, because I don't know. When Chris takes Paddy Chan to Quickville, he leads her through a portal in his bedroom. Upon seeing the disheveled state of his living quarters, Patty remarks that it's no wonder Chris needs a woman in his life. By Sonichu issue 6, Chris believed he had completed his love quest by befriending Megan Schroeder, and eventually mocked his former bitterness over not having a girlfriend. When the heroes discuss the plight of Chris Store, the subject soon turns to how jealous men can be, and Magagi wearily echoes Chris's statement that he despised nearly all of the men on Earth, simply because he couldn't get a girlfriend. A hilarious inside joke if you're Chris. Chris leads a squad into the 1996, well, into the year 1996, where he relives the moment he created Bionic the Hedgehog. In the next issue, as Locker's played a role in his inspiration, Chris extended the scene to include a gag lifted directly from an episode of Beavis and Butthead, where the two slam a locker door over and over for fun. In Sonichu issue 8, Sonichu discovers Rule 34, pictures on 4centgarbage.com, and expresses amazement that he and his friends were photographed in such intimate moments. Rose Chu pointedly informs him that the images are drawings, even though they look lifelike to Sonichu, because Chris himself drew the sex scenes on Encyclopedia Dramatica, some of which he recycled in Sonichu issue 8. The spring break feature in issue 8 features Blake getting fooled into having unprotected sex with a I'm not saying that word, which most analysts agree is a reference to Chris's own experiences getting tricked by various trolls posing as would-be girlfriends. Intentionally or not, Chris does a pretty good job projecting his own hormone-fueled foolishness onto Blake. Also, Chris attempted to impress Encyclopedia Dramatica by creating the You Know What, I Hate Me Too gallery. So, was this something that was completely intentional, or was this something that Chris just sort of managed to make happen through no careful planning or enthusiasm on his own part? We might never know. But what we do know is that Chris does not understand the concept of parody. Despite his adamant declarations that he fully understands parody, Chris has repeatedly proven himself incapable of recognizing it in the face of the genuine article. The Jimmy Hill arc was a perfect example of what a parody is, taking what he had made canon and turning it around as commentary. He makes the same error in the Adult Swim posts. He posts a rant admonishing Robot Chicken, a show centered around parody, that the canon Autobots wouldn't act the way they were portrayed, which was exactly the point. He goes on to give them a suggestion for a skit using random access humor, which thankfully was ignored. Robot Chicken actually received a lot of such complaints, and made another sketch about the GoBots acting out of character, with the addition of a whiny, bespectacled, overweight fanboy living with his parents, interjecting with complaints about inaccuracies. Coincidence? Well, I think Robot Chicken, they also did one sketch about. What's that one cartoon character? I think he's called Kevin, and he has like this imaginary like tiger, and they have adventures, and then Kevin is led to be insane, so he kills his parents. I think that was in Robot Chicken, like one of the really early ones. Again, coincidence? Well, what Chris did was a little bit just as insidious, but not nearly as gruesome. You know, it's kind of it is a bit amazing when this everything writes itself, doesn't it? Probably. It's less likely that they would reference Chris himself, as it is that Chris is such a perfect example of everything wrong with cartoon obsessed adults. To cement the fact that Chris really doesn't understand parody, only one needs to read at his comments that he made on a certain Hot Diggity Dom video. This comment has him spewing venom at the author for having murderous intent and denying that Sonic is dead. The video shows Sonic doing a comically long jumpstart and careening into the sun. It completely sailed over Chris's head that the video was done as a joke. Surprisingly, I don't think Chris has the same opinions or the same vitriol discussed about the Mario is racist video. Do you guys remember what that was? Sadly, I do, and yeah, I understand. Well, mind you, it's been a very long time since I watched that, but yeah, I'd best not go there. Instead, making him take the video seriously and believing that Hog Diggity Dom actually wanted to murder Sonic the Hedgehog. In another Sonic-related example of how Chris does not understand parody, he was enraged by a parodic fictional news story which Chris thought was real, about Sega dropping Sonic as their mascot. Hypocrisy. While Chris is quick to justify the existence of his abomination by claiming parody, he also uses the term as an attack on parodies of his own work, particularly Asperchew. He doesn't just use the term slanderous mockeries or troll works, he specifically describes them as parodies, using the term as though it were an insult and justification of his rage. When challenged on why the parodic nature of Sonichu is okay, but that of Asperchew is not, he was unable to provide an appropriate response. There's a shock. Humorously, this is the only thing he has ever actually described as a parody. whereas his own comics are at best and at worst theft of intellectual property. Part of me was about to say that's kind of, well, uh, you know, that there was a little bit more to it, but yeah, I think the law, as far as we're concerned, when it comes to Chris, is that the law is only whatever Chris chooses to make it. And unfortunately, yeah, this is one of those cases where I think it's absolutely worth pointing out that if it wasn't for anything else, then guess what? Chris would probably be left to his own devices to have gone completely mental and probably would have done something that would have gotten him into some serious trouble way back when. Thankfully, we know Chris is a little bit too lazy for this, but still, Chris would have found a way to have done it somehow. So, with all that being said and done, I will see all of you guys again next time. Thank you. All aboard!